Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well tonight. And this evening, we are going to be reading through chapter 56 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I'm getting a little sad. We're getting very close to the end. And I've been doing this for over half a year now, reading this. And I was thinking, oh, thank God I'm finally going to be finishing this. But now I think I'm going to miss all the characters. Oh well, what can you do? Well, if this is your first time watching, we're not just going to be reading the words. We're going to be stopping and talking about interesting vocabulary words. If you're learning English, words you probably don't know, I will stop when I think there's a word that would be useful for you. So there could be many big words, but unless they're useful for you, I probably won't stop and explain it. But if you're watching this with me live, then I do want you to ask about words or phrases that you don't understand. I'll just stop sometimes if you don't and explain words that I think you don't understand. But if you're watching this with me, the interesting thing is to say, hey, what does that mean? Explain this. So I definitely want you to ask questions if you're watching this with me. All right, well, let's get started with chapter 56 of David Copperfield. These last chapters are very sad. So here we go. Chapter 56, a new wound. See, a new wound, and the old. No need, O Steerforth, to have said, when we last spoke together, in that hour which I so little deemed to be our parting hour, no need to have said, think of me at my best. You see, those were Steerforth's, his best friend's, last words to him before he ran away with Emily. He knew that Davy would end up hating him, and he said, right before he left for the last time, before he died, try to think of me at my best. Don't remember the bad things about me. Think of me at my best. I had done that I had done ever, and I could change now, looking on this sight. They brought a hand bier and laid him in it. I don't know what a hand bier is. Let's see. I want to look that up. Hand bier. Must be like a barrel or something. Hand bier. Hand bier. Did I spell it correctly? Yeah. Wait, hand dash beer. Meaning. Let's see. A stand in which a corpse or coffin or casket containing a corpse is placed to lie. So, okay. So it's like a table for a dead body. They brought a hand bier and laid him on it. So he must be at the funeral, of Steerforth's funeral. And covered him with a flag, and took him up, and bore him on towards the houses. All the men who carried him had known him, and gone sailing with him, and seen him merry and bold. And gone, they carried him through the wild roar, a hush in the midst of all the tumult, and took him to the cottage where death was already. But when they set the bier down on the threshold, they looked at one another and at me, and whispered. I knew why. They felt as if it were not right to lay him down in the same quiet room. Steerforth created quite a scandal, and hurt somebody in their fisher community, so they probably don't like him very much. We went into town, and took our burden to the inn. So soon as I could at all collect my thoughts, I sent for Joram, and begged him to provide me a conveyance in which I could go to London in the night. I knew that the care of it, and the hard duty of preparing his mother to receive it, could only rest with me, and I was anxious to discharge that duty as faithfully as I could. Oh my, he's going to Steerforth's mother to tell her what happened. She hates him. She's going to blame him probably for her son's death. I chose the night for the journey, and there might be less curiosity when I left the town, but although it was nearly midnight, when I came out of the yard and the chaise, followed by what I had in charge, there were many people waiting. Oh, is he? I think maybe. Oh, he's taking Steerforth's body to his mother. At intervals along the town, and even a little way out upon the road, I saw more. But at length, only the bleak night and the open country were around me, and the ashes of my youthful friendship. Upon a mellow autumn day, about noon, when the ground was perfumed by fallen leaves and many more in beautiful tints of yellow and red and brown, yet hung upon the trees, through which the sun was shining, I arrived at Highgate. I walked the last mile, thinking as I went along of what I had to do, and left the carriage that had followed me all through the night, awaiting orders to advance. The house, when I came up to it, looked just the same. Not a blind was raised, nor sign of life in the dull paved court, and its covered way leading to the disused door. The wind had quite gone down, and nothing moved. I had not at first the courage to ring at the gate. And when I did ring, my errand seemed to me to be expressed in the very sound of the bell. The little parlor maid came out with a key in her hand, and looking earnestly at me as she unlocked the gate, said, "I beg your pardon, sir. Are you ill?" "I've been much agitated and am fatigued." "Is anything the matter, sir, Mr. James?" "Hush," said I. "Oh, yes, something wait, that's a little bit confusing. Mr. James?" Oh, she's asking, did something happen to Mr. James? So, is anything the matter, sir? Mr. James? "Hush," said I. "Yes, something has happened, and I have to break to Mrs. Steerforth. She's at home?" The girl anxiously replied that her mistress was very seldom out now, even in a carriage, and that she kept her room, and she saw no company, but would see me. Her mistress was up, she said, and Miss Dartle was with her. What message should she take upstairs? "Give her a strict charge to be careful of her manner, and only to carry in my card and say I waited. I sat in the drawing room, which we had now reached, until she should come back. Its former pleasant air of occupation was gone, and the shutters were half closed. The harp had not been used for many and many a day. His picture as a boy was there. The cabinet in which his mother had kept his letters was there. I wondered if she ever read them now, if she would ever read them more. The house was so still that I heard the girl's light step upstairs. On her return, she brought a message to the effect that Mrs. Steerforth was invalid and could not come down, but if I would excuse her being in her chamber, she would be glad to see me in a few moments. I stood before her. She was in his room, not her own. I felt, of course, that she had taken to occupy it in remembrance of him, and that many tokens of his old sports and accomplishments by which she was surrounded remained there, just as he had left them for the same reason. She murmured, however, in her reception of me, that she was out of her own chamber, because its aspect was unsuited to her infirmity. Infirmity means illness. And with her stately look, remember, stately means looking like a queen or a king, with her stately look repelled at least suspicion of the truth. At her chair, as usual, was Rosa Dartle. From the first moment of her dark eyes resting on me, I saw she knew I was the bearer of evil tidings. Bearer means somebody who carries something, and tidings is a word for news. So she knew I had some bad news. The scar sprung into view that instant. She withdrew herself a step behind the chair to keep her own face out of Mrs. Steerforth's observation, and scrutinized me. To scrutinize something is to look at something very carefully, trying to find any mistakes or any problems. Scrutinizing something. With a piercing gaze that never faltered, never shrunk. "I'm sorry to observe that you are in mourning, sir," said Mrs. Steerforth. "I am unhappily a widower," said I. "You are very young to know such a great loss," she returned. "I am grieved to hear it. I am grieved to hear it. I hope time will be good to you." "I hope time," said I, looking at her, "will be good to all of us, dear Mrs. Steerforth. We must all trust to that in our heaviest misfortunes." The earnestness of my manner and the tears in my eyes alarmed her. The whole course of her thoughts appeared to stop and change. I tried to command my voice and gently saying his name, but it trembled. You know, trembling is this. It's this kind of movement. It trembled. So he's talking, but he's trying to say his name trembling. He can't say his name because he's about to cry. She repeated it to herself 2 or 3 times in a low tone. Then addressing me, she said with enforced calmness, "My son is ill?" "Very ill." "You've seen him?" "I have." "Are you reconciled?" To reconcile, that's to be friends again. So if you have an argument with someone and then you're fighting and you're not friends anymore, but then you decide, oh, let's forget it, you have reconciled. Making up. In normal English, in contemporary normal English, you probably would just say making up. You made up? I couldn't say yes. I couldn't say no. She slightly turned her head towards the spot where Rosa Dartle had been standing at her elbow. And in that moment I said by the motion of my lips to Rosa, that Miss Steerforth might not be induced to look behind her, and read plainly written what she was not yet prepared to know. I met her look quickly, but I had seen Rosa Dartle throw her hands up in the air with vehemence of despair and horror, and then clasp them on her face. The handsome lady, so like, oh, so like, regarded me with a fixed look, and put her hand to her forehead. I besought her to be calm, and prepare herself to bear what I had to tell. But I should rather have entreated her to weep, for she sat like a stone figure. When I was last here, I faltered. To falter is to hesitate. When I was last here, I faltered. Miss Dartle told me he was sailing here and there. The night before last was a dreadful one at sea. If he were at sea that night, and near a dangerous coast, as it is said he was, and if that vessel that was seen should really be the ship which... "Rosa," said Miss Steerforth, "come to me." She came, but with no sympathy or gentleness. Her eyes gleamed like fire, and as she confronted his mother, and broke into a frightful laugh. "Now," she said, "is your pride appeased, you mad woman? Now has he made atonement to you with his life? Do you hear? His life?" Wow, that was unexpected. That's a twist. That's a plot twist. Suddenly, Rosa is very unsympathetic to the mother. Mrs. Steerforth, fallen back stiffly in her chair and making no sound but a moan, cast her eyes upon with a wide stare. "Aye," cried Rosa, smiting herself passionately on the breast. "Look at me, moan and groan, and look at me, look here, striking the scar at your dead child's handiwork." Steerforth gave her a scar. When he was a young boy, he got mad at Rosa and threw something at her face, and it cut her face and gave her a scar. Wow. The moan the mother uttered from time to time went to my heart. Always the same, always inarticulate and stifled, always accompanied with an incapable motion of the head, but with no change of the face, always proceeding from a rigid mouth and closed teeth, as if the jaw were locked and the face frozen up in pain. "Do you remember when he did this?" she proceeded. "Do you remember when in his inheritance of your nature and your pampering of his pride and passion he did this and disfigured me for life?" When you disfigure someone, you alter you change them from looking normal to looking not normal. That's a disfigurement. So he disfigured her. He gave her that mark on her face. "Look at me, marked until I die with his high displeasure, and moan and groan for what you made him." "Miss Dartle," I entreated her, "for heaven's sake." "I will speak," she said, turning on me with her lightning eyes. "Be silent, you. Look at me. I say, proud mother of proud, false son, moan for your nurture of him, moan for your corruption of him, moan for your loss of him, moan for mine." her clenched hand, these are clenched hands. She's got like a fist. She's angry. She's ready to hurt someone. She clenched her hand and trembled through her spare, worn figure, as if her passion were killing her by inches. "You resent his self-will," she exclaimed. "You, injured by his haughty temper, you, who opposed to both. When your hair was gray, the qualities which made both when you gave him birth. You, from his cradle, reared him to be what he was, and stunted what he should have been. Are you rewarded now for your years of trouble?" "Oh, Miss Dartle, shame! Oh, cruel!" "I tell you," she returned, "I will speak to her. No power on earth should stop me. While I was standing here, have I been silent all these years, and shall I not speak now? I loved him better than you ever loved him," turning on her fiercely. "I could have loved him, and asked no return, if I had been his wife. I could have been the slave of his caprices for a word of love a year. I should have been. Who knows it better than I? You were exacting, proud, punctilious." We better look up that word. Punctilious. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Let's see. A fine or petty point of conduct or procedure.
Punctilio.
Yeah, punctilious. Punctilio, punctilious, probably the same. So petty, being very small, thinking about small things, being obsessed with small things. You were exacting, proud, punctilious, selfish. My love would have been devoted, would have trod your paltry whimpering underfoot. With flashing eyes, she stamped upon the ground, as if she actually did it. "Look here," she said, striking the scar again with a relentless hand. When he grew into the better understanding of what he had done, he saw it, and he repented of it. I could sing to him and talk to him, and show the ardor that I felt in all he did, and attain with labor to such knowledge as most interested him. And I attracted him when he was freshest and truest. He loved me. Yeah, he did. Many a time when you were put off with a slight word, he has taken me to his heart." She said it with a taunting pride, in the midst of her frenzy, for it was little less, yet with an eager remembrance of it, in which the smoldering embers of a gentler feeling kindled for the moment. I descended as I might have known I should, but that he fascinated me with his boyish courtship into a doll, a trifle for the occupation of an idle hour, to be dropped, taken up, and trifled with. As the inconstant humor took him, when he grew wary, I grew wary. We've seen that word many times. Wary means tired. So when he got bored, I got bored. When he got tired, I got tired. When he grew wary, I grew wary. As his fancy died out, I would no more have tried to strengthen any power I had than I would have married him on his being forced to take me for his wife. We fell away from one another without a word. Perhaps you saw it, and were not sorry. And since then, I've been a mere disfigured piece of furniture between you both, having no eyes, no ears, no feelings, no remembrances. Moan, moan for what you made him, not for your love. I tell you that the time was when I loved him better than you ever did. She stood with her bright, angry eyes confronting the wide stare and set face, and softened no more when the moaning was repeated than if the face had been a picture. Miss Dartle, said I, if you can be so obdurate as not to feel for this afflicted mother, who feels for me? She sharply retorted. She has sown this. To sow something means planting seeds. So this is not sow, S-E-W. So this is sow, S-E-W, when you're making clothes or fixing clothes. This is S-O-W, and that means putting seeds in the ground. Wait, reaping, sowing. Yeah, sowing is putting the seeds in the ground, planting the seeds. So when she says she has sown this, this means she planted that seed a long time ago, and now the flower has come up, and now she's getting the fruit. Who feels for me? She sharply retorted. She has sown this. Let her moan for the harvest that she reaps today. Harvesting is when you take the fruit from the tree, or you take the corn from the field. That's the harvest time. That's usually in autumn. Reaping is the same thing. So she's saying, let her reap what she has planted. Let her harvest what she has planted. And if his faults, I began. Faults, she cried, bursting into passionate tears. Who dares malign him? He had a soul worth millions of the friends to whom he stooped. No one can have love for him better. No one can hold him in dearer remembrance than I replied. I meant to say, if you have no compassion for his mother, or if his faults, you have been bitter on them. It's false, she cried, tearing her black hair. I loved him. If his faults cannot, I went on, be banished from your remembrance in such an hour, look at the figure, even as one you have never seen before, and render it some help. All this time, the figure was unchanged. The figure they're talking about is the mother who just heard that her son is dead. She's in shock. She's just sitting there in shock. And then Rosa is abusing her for all the years. Oh, gosh. So all the time, the figure, the face of the mother is unchanged. She's just sitting there, saying nothing, no change in the expression, and looked unchangeable, motionless, rigid, staring, moaning in the same dumb way from time to time, with the same helpless motion of the head, but giving no other sign of life. Miss Dartle suddenly kneeled down before it and began to loosen the dress. "A curse upon you," she said, looking round at me with a mingled expression of rage and grief. "It was in an evil hour that you ever came here. A curse upon you. Go." After passing out of the room, I hurried back to ring the bell, the sooner to alarm the servants. She had then taken the impassive figure in her arms, and still upon her knees, was weeping over it, kissing it, calling to it, rocking it to and fro, her bosom like a child, and trying every tender means to rouse the dormant senses. No longer afraid of leaving her, I noiselessly turned back again and alarmed the house as I went out. Later in that day I returned, and we laid him on his mother's room. And she was just the same, they told me. Miss Dartle never left her. The doctors were in attendance. Many things had been tried, but she lay like a statue, except for the low sound now and then. I went through the dreary house, and the darkened windows, and the windows of the chamber where he lay. I darkened last. I lifted up the leaden hand, and so he's at his friend Steerforth's dead body, and he lifted up his hand, and I lifted up the leaden hand. Lead is a heavy metal, so it feels like lead. It's cold and very heavy. I lifted up the leaden hand and held it to my heart. And all the world seemed death and silence, broken only by his mother's moaning. Okay, well that was a very short chapter, so I think we'll continue, and we'll start chapter 57. The Emigrants. Hopefully, I think the last 4 chapters have all been very depressing and dramatic and sad. Hopefully this is not so sad, but I guess it will be, because this is the end of the book and we're saying goodbye to everyone. Either people are dying or they're going away to Australia. One thing more I had to do before yielding myself to the shock of these emotions. It was to conceal what had occurred from those who were going away, and to dismiss them on their voyage in happy ignorance. In this, no time was to be lost. So Davy didn't tell everybody about what happened in Yarmouth. So he just hid that, because he didn't want this to be... It's already a sad occasion that he's saying goodbye to all these people who he loves. So he didn't want to tell them this bad news. I took Mr. Micawber aside that same night and confided to him the task of standing between Mr. Peggotty and intelligence of the late catastrophe. He zealously undertook to do so. So Davy, actually, by the end of the evening, he told Mr. Micawber, look, try to keep this news away from... I don't remember what happened to Ham. I think Ham died. Yeah, maybe Ham also died. So he's trying to hide this from Mr. Peggotty, because if Mr. Peggotty learns that Ham died, he'll never get on the boat and go to Australia. And he really has to do that. So he's telling Mr. Micawber, keep Mr. Peggotty away from any kind of news. He zealously undertook to do so, and to intercept any newspaper through which it might, without such precautions, reach him. "If it penetrates to him, sir," said Mr. Micawber, striking himself on the breast, "I shall first pass through this body." So that's Mr. Micawber speak that I'll die before I let him see a newspaper. Mr. Micawber, I must observe, in his adaptation of himself to a new state of society, had acquired a bold, buccaneering air. Not absolutely lawless, but defensive and prompt. One might have supposed him a child of the wilderness, long accustomed to live out the confines of civilization, and about to return to his native wilds. He had provided himself, among other things, with a complete suit of oilskin, and a straw hat, with a very low crown, pitched or cocked on the side. In this rough clothing, with a common mariner's telescope under his arm, and a shrewd trick of casting up his eye to the sky, as looking out for dirty weather, he was far more nautical after his manner than Mr. Peggotty, his whole family, if I may so express it, was cleared for action. I found Mrs. Micawber in the closet, and most uncompromising of bonnets, and made fast under the chin in a shawl which tied her up, as I had been tied up when my aunt first received me, like a bundle, and was secured behind at the waist in a strong knot. Miss Micawber, I found, made snug for stormy weather. Snug is when you feel nice and warm and comfortable. So if it's cold and you take a blanket and you wrap yourself in the blanket and you feel nice and warm and comfortable, you're snug. You're snug as a bug in a rug. Miss Micawber I found made snug for stormy weather in the same manner, with nothing superfluous about her. Master Micawber was hardly visible in the Guernsey shirt and the shaggiest suit of slops I ever saw. And the children were done up like preserved meats, in impervious cases. Both Mr. Micawber and his eldest son wore their sleeves loosely, turned back at the wrists, and being ready to lend a hand in any direction and tumble up or sing out, "Yo heave ho," in the shortest notice. That yo heave ho, that's sailor talk. Heave means pull. So they were ready to participate and help the sailors on the boat. Thus Traddles and I found them at nightfall, assembled on the wooden steps, at the time known as Hungerford Stairs, watching the departure of a boat with some of their property on board. I had told Traddles of the terrible event, and it had greatly shocked him. But there could be no doubt of the kindness of keeping it a secret, and he had come to help me in this last service. It was here that I took Mr. Micawber aside and received his promise. The Micawber family were lodged in a little dirty... The Micawber family were lodged in a little dirty, tumble-down public house, which in those days was close to the stairs, and whose protruding wooden rooms overhung the river. The family, as emigrants, being objects of some interest in and about Hungerford, attracted so many beholders that we were glad to take refuge in their room. It was one of the wooden chambers upstairs, with the tide flowing underneath. My aunt and Agnes were there, busily making some little extra comforts in the way of dress for the children. Peggotty was quietly assisting with the old insensible workbox, yard measure, and a bit of wax candle before her that now outlived so much. It was not easy to answer her enquiries, still less to whisper Mr. Peggotty, when Mr. Micawber brought him in, that I had given the letter, and all was well. But I did both, and made them happy. If I showed any trace of what I felt, my own sorrows were sufficient to account for it. "And when does the ship sail, Mr. Micawber?" asked my aunt. Mr. Micawber considered it necessary to prepare either my aunt or his wife by degrees, and said sooner than he had expected yesterday. "The boat brought you word, I suppose?" said my aunt. "It did, ma'am," he returned. "Well, and she sails?" "Madam," he replied, "I am informed that we must positively be on board before 7 tomorrow morning. "Heyday," said my aunt. "That's soon." "Is it a sea-going fact, Mr. Peggotty?" "'Tis so, ma'am. She'll drop down the river with that there tide, if Master Davy and my sister comes aboard at Gravesend arter noon o' next day. They'll see the last on us." "And that we shall do," said I, "be sure. So the boat is leaving tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock. "Until then, until we are at sea," observed Mr. Micawber with a glance of intelligence at me, "Mr. Peggotty and myself will constantly keep a double lookout together on our goods and chattels." "Emma, chattels just means property." "Emma, my love," said Mr. Micawber, clearing his throat with his magnificent way, "my friend Mr. Thomas Traddles is so obliging as to solicit in my ear that he should have the privilege of ordering the ingredients necessary to the composition of a moderate portion of that beverage which is peculiarly associated in our minds with roast beef of old England. I allude to, in short, punch." Mr. Micawber wants to make his famous punch before they leave one last time. "Under ordinary circumstances I should scruple to entreat the indulgence of Miss Trotwood and Miss Wickfield, but I can only say for myself," said my aunt, "that I will drink all happiness and success to you, Mr. Micawber, with the utmost pleasure." "And I too," said Agnes with a smile. So Mr. Micawber was thinking probably Agnes and Aunt Betsy would not drink, but they said, "Oh no, we will drink. We will toast and be happy to see you off." Mr. Micawber immediately descended to the bar, where he appeared to be quite at home, and in due time returned with a steaming jug. I could not but observe that he had been peeling the lemons with his own clasp knife, which, as became the knife of a practical settler, was about a foot long, and which he wiped, not wholly without ostentation, on the sleeve of his coat. Mrs. Micawber and the two elder members of the family I now found to be provided with similar formidable instruments, while every child had its own wooden spoon attached to its body by a strong line. In a similar anticipation of life afloat and in the bush, Mr. Micawber, instead of helping Mrs. Micawber and his eldest son and daughter to punch and wine glasses, which he might easily have done, for there was a shelf full in the room, served it out to them in a series of villainous little tin pots. And I never saw him enjoy anything so much as drinking out of his own particular pint pot, and putting it in his pocket at the close of the evening. "The luxuries of the old country," said Mr. Micawber with an intense satisfaction in their renouncement, "we abandon. The denizens of the forest cannot, of course, expect to participate in the refinements of the land of the free." Here a boy came in to say that Mr. Micawber was wanted downstairs. "I have a presentiment," said Mrs. Micawber, setting down her tin pot, "that is a member of my family." "If so, my dear," observed Mr. Micawber, with his usual suddenness of warmth on that subject, "as the member of your family, whoever he, she, or it may be, has kept us waiting for a considerable period, perhaps the member may now wait my convenience." "Micawber," said his wife in a low tone, "at such a time as this." Mr. Micawber is saying, "Oh, they never ever wanted to see me before, so now they can wait downstairs." and his wife is saying, "Come on, not today. Not like this. This is our last night. We're leaving." It is not to meet, said Mr. Micawber, rising, that every nice offence should bear its comment, Emma. I stand reproved. The loss, Micawber, observed his wife, has been my family's, not yours. If my family are at length sensible of the deprivation to which their own conduct has, has in the past, sorry, I lost my place for a moment, has in the past exposed them, and now desire to extend the hand of fellowship. Let it not be repulsed. My dear, he returned, so be it. So she's saying, just let them come up, don't act like this, just be kind, and he says, okay, fine. If not for their sakes, for mine, Micawber, said his wife. Emma, he returned, that view of the question is at such a moment irresistible. I cannot even now distinctly pledge myself to fall upon your family's neck. But the member of your family who is now in attendance shall have no genial warmth frozen by me. Mr. Micawber withdrew, and was absent some little time, in the course of which Mrs. Micawber was not wholly free from an apprehension that words might have arisen between him and the member. At length, the same boy reappeared and presented me with a note written in pencil and headed in a legal manner, Heap, oh no, Heap versus Micawber. From this document, I learned that Mr. Micawber, being again arrested, was in a final paroxysm of despair, and that he begged me to send him his knife and pint pot by bearer, as they might prove serviceable during the brief remainder of his existence in jail. So he got arrested again. There was no relative waiting downstairs. That was just a trick to get him to come downstairs so they could arrest him and take him to jail. And then he sent a note. Please send my tin pot and my knife, because they'll be very useful to me as I die in jail. He also requested, as a last act of friendship, that I would see his family to the parish workhouse, and to forget that such a being ever lived. Of course, I answered this note by going down with the boy to pay the money, where I found Mr. Micawber sitting in a corner, looking darkly at the sheriff's officer who had effected the capture. On his release, he embraced me with the utmost fervor, and made an entry of the transaction in his pocket-book, being very particular. I recollect about a halfpenny, and I inadvertently omitted my statement of the total. This momentous pocket-book was a timely reminder to him of another transaction on our return to the room upstairs, where he accounted for his absence by saying that it had been occasioned by circumstances over which he had no control. He had took out of it a large sheet of paper, folded small, and quite covered with long sums carefully worked, from the glimpse I had of them. I should say that I never saw such sums out of a school ciphering book. These, it seemed, were calculations of compound interest on what he called the principal amount of 41, 10, 11 and a half for various periods. So this is just Victorian money, which is very confusing. I don't understand it. After a careful consideration of these, an elaborate estimate of his resources, he had come to the conclusion to select that sum which represented the amount with compound interest to 2 years, 15 calendar months, and 14 days from that date. For this he had drawn a note of hand with the great neatness which he had handed over to Traddles on the spot. Now that's a very interesting phrase, on the spot. We've seen that several times, and it's very useful because what it means is right at the moment, right in the place. So when you say something happened on the spot, it means it happened at that moment. It happened in that location. a discharge of his debt in full, as between man and man, with many acknowledgments. I still have a presentiment," said Mrs. Micawber, pensively shaking her head, "that my family will appear on board before we finally depart." Mr. Micawber evidently had his presentiment. Oh, presentiment just means prediction, so they didn't really know that it was one of Mrs. Micawber's relatives come to visit. But they were just assuming that was probably what it was. It wasn't. It was the sheriff who wanted to arrest him. Who did arrest him. Mr. Micawber evidently had his presentiment on the subject too. Prediction. But he put it in his tin pot and swallowed it. "If you have any opportunity of sending letters home on your passage, Mrs. Micawber," said my aunt, "you must let us hear from you, you know." "Oh, my dear Miss Trotwood," she replied, "I shall be only too happy to think that anyone expects to hear from us. I shall not fail to correspond. Mr. Copperfield, I trust, as an old and familiar friend, will not object to receive occasional intelligence himself from one who knew him when the twins were yet unconscious." I said that I should hope to hear whenever she had an opportunity of writing. "Please heaven, there will be many such opportunities," said Mr. Micawber. "The ocean in these times is a perfect fleet of ships, and we can hardly fail to encounter many in running over. It is merely crossing," said Mr. Micawber, trifling with his eyeglass. We've seen trifle to mean like little unimportant thing, but if you use trifling like a verb, it means like playing with, like doing something stupid, something weird, a little something with his eyeglasses. So he's just playing with his eyeglasses a little bit. Merely crossing the distance is quite imaginary. Merely crossing. The distance is quite imaginary. I think now how odd it was, but how wonderfully like Mr. Micawber that when he went from London to Canterbury, he should have talked as if he were going to the farthest limits of the earth. And when he went from England to Australia, as if he were just going from a little trip across the Channel. "On the voyage I shall endeavour," endeavour means try. "On the voyage I shall endeavour," said Mr. Micawber, "occasionally to spin them a yarn." That means like tell them a tale, tell them a story. "And the melody of my son Wilkins will, I trust, be acceptable at the galley fire." When Mrs. Micawber has her sea legs on, an expression in which I hope there is no conventional impropriety, she will give them, I dare say, little tafflin. Porpoises and dolphins, I believe, will be frequently observed athwart our bows. Our bows. And either on the starboard or the larboard quarter objects of interest will be continually descried. In short, said Mr. Micawber, with old genteel air, the probability is all will be found so exciting, alow and aloft, and when the lookout stationed in the main top cries, "Land-o!" we shall be very considerably astonished. With that he flourished off the contents of his little tin pot. And if he had made the as if he had made the voyage and had passed the first-class examination before the highest naval authorities. "What I chiefly hope, my dear Mr. Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber, "is that in some branches of our family we may live again in the old country. Do not frown, Micawber. I do not refer to my own family, but to our children's children. However vigorous the sapling, sapling is a baby tree," said Mrs. Micawber, shaking her head. "I cannot forget the parent tree, and when our race attains to eminence and fortune, I own I should wish that fortune to flow into the coffers of Britannia." "My dear," said Mr. Micawber, "Britannia must take her chance. I am bound to say that she has never done much for me, and that I have no particular wish upon the subject." "Micawber," returned Mrs. Micawber, "there, you are wrong. You are going out, Miss Micawber, to this distant clime to strengthen, not to weaken, the connection between yourself and Albion." "The connection in question, my love," rejoined Mr. Micawber, "has not laid me, I repeat, under the load of personal obligation, that I am at all insensitive to the formation of another connection." So Mrs. Micawber is saying, yes, we're going away to Australia, but I hope one day we can return. And then she's saying, don't worry, I'm not talking about we, us. I'm talking about maybe our children or our grandchildren will return. And Mr. Micawber is saying, why? This place has never done anything for us. And that annoyed Mrs. Micawber. "Micawber," returned Mrs. Micawber, "there, I again say, you're wrong. You do not know your power, Micawber. It is that which will strengthen, even in this step you were about to take, the connection between yourself and Albion." Mr. Micawber sat in his elbow chair, with his eyebrows raised, half receiving and half repudiating Mrs. Micawber's views as they were stated, but very sensible of their foresight. "My dear Mr. Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber, "I wish Mr. Micawber to feel his position. It appears to me highly important that Mr. Micawber should, from the hour of his embarkation, feel his position. Your old knowledge of me, my dear Mr. Copperfield, will have told you that I have not the sanguine disposition of Mr. Micawber. My disposition is, if I may say so, eminently practical. I know that this is a long voyage. I know that it will involve many privations and inconveniences. I cannot shut my eyes to those facts, but I also know what Mr. Micawber is. I know the latent power of Mr. Micawber, and therefore I consider it vitally important that Mr. Micawber should feel his position." "My love," he observed, "perhaps you will allow me to remark that it is barely possible that I do feel my position at the present moment." "I think not, Micawber," she rejoined. "Not fully, my dear Mr. Copperfield. Mr. Micawber is not a common case. Mr. Micawber is going to a distant country expressly in order that he may be fully understood and appreciated for the first time. I wish Mr. Micawber to take his stand upon that vessel's prow and firmly say, 'This country I am come to conquer. Have you honors? Have you riches? Have you posts of profitable pecuniary emolument? Let them be brought forward. They are mine.'" Mr. Micawber, glancing at us all, seemed to think there was a good deal in this idea. "I wish, Mr. Micawber, if I make myself understood," said Mrs. Micawber, with an argumentative tone, "to be the Caesar of his own fortunes. That, my dear Mr. Copperfield, appears to me to be his true position." So Mrs. Micawber is saying, He's not taking this seriously. I want him to think of this like the new beginning. I want him to go to Australia, to conquer Australia, to become rich, to become important, to become something special. I wish Mr. Micawber to stand upon that vessel's prow and say, "Enough of delay, enough of disappointment, enough of limited means." That was in the old country. This is the new. Produce your reparation. Bring it forward. Mr. Micawber folded his arms in a resolute manner, as if he were then stationed on the figurehead. "And doing that," said Mrs. Micawber, feeling his position, "am I not right in saying that Mr. Micawber will strengthen and not weaken his connection with Britain? An important public character arising in that hemisphere. Shall I be told that its influence will not be felt at home? Can I be so weak as to imagine that Mr. Micawber, wielding the rod of talent and of power in Australia, will be nothing in England? I am but a woman, but I should be unworthy of myself and of my papa if I were guilty of such absurd weakness." Mrs. Micawber's conviction that her arguments were unanswerable gave a moral elevation to her tone, which I think I had never heard in it before. "And therefore it is," said Mrs. Micawber, "that I the more wish that at a future period we may live again on the parent soil. Mr. Micawber may be, I cannot disguise from myself that the probability is Mr. Micawber will be a page of history, and he ought then to be represented in the country which gave him birth, and not give him employment." "My love," observed Mr. Micawber, "it is impossible for me not to be touched by your affection. I am always willing to defer to your good sense. What will be, will be. Heaven forbid that I should grudge my native country any portion of the wealth that may be accumulated by our descendants." "That's well," said my aunt, nodding towards Mr. Peggotty, "and I drink my love to you all, and every blessing and success attend you." Mr. Peggotty put down the two children he had been nursing, one on each knee, to join Mr. and Mrs. Micawber in drinking to all of us in return, and when he and the Micawbers cordially shook hands as comrades, and his brown face brightened with a smile, I felt that he would make his way, establish a good name, and be beloved, go where he would. Even the children were instructed each to dip a wooden spoon into Mr. Micawber's pot and pledge us in his contents. When this was done, my aunt and Agnes rose and parted from the emigrants. It was a sorrowful farewell. They were all crying. The children hung about Agnes to the last, and we left poor Mrs. Micawber in a very distressed condition, sobbing and weeping by a dim candle that must have made the room look from the river like a miserable lighthouse. I went down again the next morning to see that they were away. They had departed in a boat as early as 5 o'clock. It was a wonderful instance to me of the gap such partings make, that although my association of them with the tumble-down public house and the wooden stairs dated only from last night, both seemed dreary and deserted now that they were gone. In the afternoon the next day, my old nurse and I went down to Gravesend, and we found the ship in the river, surrounded by a crowd of boats, a favorable wind blowing, a signal for sailing at her masthead. I hired a boat directly, and we put off to her, and getting through the little vortex of confusion, of which she was the center, went on board. Mr. Peggotty was waiting for us on deck. He told me that Mr. Micawber had just now been arrested again, and for the last time, at the suit of Heap, and that, in compliance with a request I had made to him, he had paid the money, which I repaid him. He then took us down between the decks, and there any lingering fears I had of his having heard any rumors of what had happened were dispelled by Mr. Micawber's coming out of the gloom, taking his arm with an air of friendship and protection, and telling me that they had scarcely been asunder for a moment since the night last. It was a strange scene to me, and it's so confined and dark that at first I could make out hardly anything, but by degrees it cleared as my eyes became more accustomed to the gloom, and I seemed to stand in a picture by Ostade. Among the great beams, bulks, and ring-bolts of the ship, and the emigrant berths, and chests, and bundles, and barrels, and heaps of miscellaneous baggage lighted up, and here and there by dangling lanterns, and elsewhere by yellow daylight straying down a windsail or a hatchway, were the crowded groups of people, making new friendships, taking leave of one another, talking, laughing, crying, eating, and drinking. Some already settled down into the possession of their new few feet of space, with their little households arranged, and tiny children established on stools or in dwarf elbow chairs, others despairing of a resting place and wandering disconsolately. From babies who had been a week or two of life behind them, to crooked old men and women who seemed to have but a week or two of life before them, and from the ploughmen bodily carrying out the soil of England on their boots, to smiths taking away samples of its soot and smoke upon their skins, every age and occupation appeared to be crammed into a narrow compass of the 'tween decks. As my eye glanced round to this place, I thought I saw, sitting by an open port, with one of the Micawber children near her, a figure like Emily's. It first attracted my attention by another figure parting from it with a kiss, as it glided calmly away through the disorder, reminding me of Agnes. But in the rapid motion and confusion, and in the unsettlement of my own thoughts, I lost it again, and only knew that the time was come when all visitors were being warned to leave the ship, that my nurse was crying on a chest beside me, and that Mrs. Gummidge, assisted by some younger stooping woman in black, was busily arranging Mr. Peggotty's goods. "Is there any last word, Master Davy?" said he. "Is there any one forgotten thing afore we parts?" "One thing," said I. "Martha." He touched the younger woman I had mentioned on the shoulder, and Martha stood before me. "Heaven bless you, you good man," cried I. "You take her with you." She answered for him with a burst of tears. I could speak no more at the moment, but I wrung his hand. And if I ever have loved and honored any man, I loved and honored that man in my soul. The ship was clearing fast of strangers. The greatest trial that I had remained. I told him what the noble spirit that was gone had given me in charge to say at parting. It moved him deeply, but when he charged me in return with many messages of affection and regret for those deaf ears, he moved me more. The time was come. I embraced him, took my weeping nurse upon my arm, and hurried away on deck. I took leave of poor Mrs. Micawber. She was looking distractedly about for her family even then, and her last words to me were that she never would desert Mr. Micawber. We went over the side into our boat and lay at a little distance to see the ship wafted on her. Wafting is like this, when something is moving like this, moving away like this. We went over the side into our boat and lay a little distance to see the ship wafted on her course. It was then calm, radiant sunset. She lay between us and the red light, and every taper line and spar was visible against the glow, a sight at once so beautiful, so mournful, so hopeful, as the glorious ship lying still on the flushed water, with all the life on board her crowded at the bulwarks. And there, clustering for a moment, bare-headed and silent, I never saw. Silent, only for a moment, as the sails rose to the wind, and the ship began to move. There broke from all the boats 3 resounding cheers, which those on the board took up and echoed back, and which were echoed and re-echoed, and my heart burst out when I heard the sound and beheld the waving of hats and handkerchiefs. And then I saw her. Then I saw her at her uncle's side and trembling on his shoulder. He pointed to us with an eager hand, and she saw us, and she waved her last goodbye to me. I, Emily, beautiful and drooping, cling to him with the utmost trust of thy bruised heart, for he has clung to thee, and with all the might of his great love. Surrounded by the rosy light and standing high upon the deck, apart together, she clinging to him and he holding her, they solemnly passed away. The night had fallen on the Kentish hills when we rowed ashore, and fallen darkly upon me. All right, well, that was the end of chapter 57 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Just a few more chapters left. We're almost at the end of the book. Thank you for watching. I hope you come back. I think probably tomorrow night I should read a few more chapters, hopefully, if I'm not too tired. And we'll finish this book finally after such a long time. I hope you come back tomorrow to watch as we get near the end of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Have a good night.